So we now continue to our second panel discussion, debt market dynamics and credit ratings. The session will be chaired by Mr. Juan Garmendia, Senior Emerging Market Analyst at StoneX Group, Inc., who specializes in sovereign and corporate debt across frontier and high-yield markets. Joining him on the panel are Ms. Khulan Bat-Erdene, Deputy Minister of Finance of Mongolia, with over 14 years of experience spanning government advisory, global asset management, and sustainable finance. Mr. Otunbatar Amarzaya, CEO of Garmendia Bank, bringing over 16 years of experience at the bank with deep expertise in internal audit, strategic operations, and capital markets. Mr. Nikolai Dimitrov, Executive Director at Morgan Stanley Investment Management, with over 2 decades of experience and deep expertise in emerging market securities. Please welcome our panelists to the stage.
Thank you very much for everybody to be here. I think we're going to keep it short and sweet, and then maybe we can go for some Q&A to make it a little bit more interactive. Well, panelists, thank you very much for coming. And if you don't mind, let me start with the representative of the Minister of Finance. Maybe we can talk a little bit about what is happening at the moment. When I started looking at Mongolia 4 or 5 years ago, it was more like a rollover story. I think it was all over the place. We were discussing that in the IMF, and then a lot of investors were looking at it. Now seems like we have a more credit spread story. Some people might say that it trades quite tight. Do you think that that's the reality? You think that it actually is a result of what is happening right now in Mongolia? And also, do people should be looking at what is happening on a policy-making situation, right? If that matters or not, and if that is priced in the current levels?
Good afternoon, everyone. Close to lunch, just bear with us for another few minutes. Directly to your question, indeed, some years ago, 10 years ago, our external debt to GDP was 93%, and 4 years ago it was 75%. And today, as of 2025, it's 39% of the GDP. So I'm not trying to demonize external debt, or, it depends whether it's too much or too less and what we are financing it for. So in that respect, between 2017 to 2025, indeed, it was a rollover story. It was about $5 billion rollover, and that was unsustainable. So since then, as Amar Baisaklang has mentioned in his presentation, there was a 3 times credit upgrade, and the spreads are tightening, which is not necessarily a really nice thing for our investors, but for government, it's the taxpayers' money that we pay back, right? So it's a good thing for us. So back to your question, we are cautiously optimistic about it. And although our last sovereign issue was beginning of March, which was right after the Middle East conflict. And these days, uncertainty seems to be the new certainty, and we just have to be proactive rather than reactive, and at the same time being really adaptive and pragmatic in our policy making. So our government debt strategy is defined every 3 years, and it's been like this for the past 10 years. Thanks to the sustainable debt management, we brought the debt level into a really prudent level, which is in line with the OECD emerging market percentage. That's about 50 to 60%. So as of today, it's about 40% of the GDP, and we still have some buffer there just in case things go wrong.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think, as you mentioned it, right, in the last years, the main focus of the government was to bring down that debt to GDP. What would you say is the focus right now of the Ministry of Finance? Like for the next 2-3 years, where are you guys focusing?
So as per our latest approved debt management strategy, which is between 2026 to 2028, we won't be necessarily issuing new debt, but we will work on our existing debt and probably refinance if there is a need be, and if we see more tightening spread. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we will be just sitting there and waiting. We need different kind of funding resources. A sovereign bond is one really good existing channel that we have built over time, and we have a really good breadth of investors. Some of them are already in this room, but our need in terms of financing is not necessarily a bond, but sometimes it's a project, sometimes it's an industrial park, and sometimes it's, as Franklin Templeton mentioned in their presentation, it's the SOE, reducing the government share of the SOE and bringing more private players into the game. So our policy is to the new government's policy is really to deregulate to the minimum possible, and red tape reduction, and use non-fiscal measures to enable private sectors, because they're the players and they should be the economic engine of growth, and hence it's sustainable and it's more inclusive and it creates more job and it brings more innovation into the market. And at the same time, we are open to different kind of resources that is suited to what the investee need be. So dialogues like this is really important platform, I would say. It's the third time it's happening in New York, and it's my third time also participating in this forum in different capacity, but probably this one is the first time that Ministry of Finance is present with all our policies. And we are here not only to say what we think, also it's vice versa, right? So we want to hear your constructive feedbacks and what works, what seemed to be the next thing we should collectively do, and hopefully after this event, we will have continue to have an engaging dialogue.
Thank you very much, and that's a nice way to finish the answer to go for my following question, which is for Nick. As being on the other side, right, on the client side or investor side, maybe if I can put some questions together, will be, what do you think clients or investors focus when they look at the sovereign itself? Secondly, will be, what do you think is the focus right now in Mongolia? Like, you think that they are focusing on the credit or on the policy making or on the fundamentals, the mining? What do you think they are focusing on? And then, just to finish, is, do you think that there are going to be a shift in that view for the next 12 months? You think that people is becoming more cautious or taking a look into certain things that might change their view in Mongolia itself?
Sure. So anything that I'm going to say it from the point of view as someone that actually owns Mongolia risk. Generally, we have a positive view on Mongolia, which is why we are involved in the country and we've been supportive over the last several years. In order to form the investment thesis to get engaged in a certain geography, we would normally first look at the fundamentals, right? This is kind of the basic building block. Once we figured out the fundamentals and we feel comfortable there, then we look at commodities. And in the case of Mongolia, whether you agree or disagree, the reality is that the market looks at Mongolia very much as a play on commodities, specifically two commodities, right? We were talking about coking coal and then copper, right? So you have to kind of be on top of where these commodities are trading. On the policy side, sometimes it tends to get noisy, and there was noise last year. I have to say, a lot of times we kind of try to look through that noise, but that would require that the institutional strength is not compromised and that the financial stability is still there. So as far as these requirements are available, often we would kind of try to ignore some of that noise and have kind of a longer term view on the credit. Now, when it comes down to what can happen over the coming months that can potentially, make us reassess our view, I think the most important thing that we pay attention to is the financial stability. Sorry, the fiscal stability. We believe that as far as Mongolia maintains a tight fiscal, even if there is volatility that comes through the commodity exposure. And as we know, commodity cycles tend to be fairly cyclical, which kind of import that cyclicality into the performance of the Mongolian economy. We're going to be fine. We believe that tight fiscal allows Mongolia to withstand to some volatility. So this is probably the first thing that we monitor very closely. And I already mentioned, I'm repeating myself here a little bit, but we obviously keep a very close eye on prices. Like personally, there's actually an index on Bloomberg. Those of you that have access to Bloomberg, you can see the prices of Mongolia's coking coal that is being exported to China. So you can kind of stay on top of these developments almost kind of real time. And then the last thing that we care about is reform momentum. And we fully understand that when it comes down to reforms, there's always kind of ebbs and flows, right? It's never exactly consistent, but what matters for us is that in the long run, Mongolia remains on that reform trajectory, and there is improvement over time. So that's kind of the gist of it when it comes down to the sovereign. But again, I'm underlying that tight fiscal is probably the thing that we care the most.
Thank you very much. And now going from the sovereign into the macro players, right, the banks. Maybe if you can tell us a bit, Mr. Ogan-Battar, on terms of Golem, right, when you look at it, do you think that banks still should be seen as a spillover story from the sovereign? And I think we have talked about this many times, but do you think that Golem and the issuers should be look at themselves like a standalone credit?
Yes, so international market access still closely linked to sovereign, of course. Investors usually they first look the macro outlook, sovereign risks, etc. But we do see clear progress. So year by year, investors becoming more issuer specific. So more about that company's fundamentals, governance, transparency, reporting, as well as one of the most important thing is investor relations. So I can say that, especially Khulan Bank, since our international bond issue, we do a lot of investor relations thing. So of course, our financials are improving, but meantime, we never forgot to improve our investor relation. That gives us huge advantage. So I remember first time I met with Nick in 2024. He asked a lot of questions. So, and that time I was surprised that, wow, he knows our bank better than us. So then, since then, we never forget the institutional investors. We monthly, weekly, we send some information, how it's going on, not only in Mongolia, not only in Khulan Bank, Mongolian political situation, macro outlook, banking sector. So the short answer is yes, still linked to international sovereign, but day by day, investors becoming more issuer specific.
And you think that the banks find themselves in a better situation than other corporates in Mongolia? Maybe because one bank started and then they'll follow, or is because people is just more comfortable in the banks? I don't know, any view on that? Because it's clearly a more banking issuer.
Yeah, so the Mongolia has always been the bank-dominated country, especially financial market is always. So last few years, capital market is increasing a lot, developing a lot, and also many of our the customers, big institutions, they're exploring idea of going for international market. So we give a lot of advice for them for implementing more international standard, reporting, etc. So soon there will be a lot of companies issuing the bond, equities, in international market.
And maybe when we talk about the banks in specific, you think that when you compare about the amounts of issuers right now with the market overall, you think that is getting overcrowded a little bit? What do you think about the banking system overall in Mongolia? You think there is enough space for everybody to go issue and lend the money internally, or you think that is getting more tight every day? You have any view on that?
No, as I said before, Mongolian banking sector is always leading sector in Mongolia. So that means, and also, I think 17% of total bank liabilities related to international funding. And also Mongolian banking sector is almost Mongolian macroeconomy proxy. So that means as of today, we're expecting around 5 to 6% GDP growth this year. That means Mongolian banking sector will grow at least more than 15, 16%. That means there is a lot of opportunity to Mongolian bank to enter the capital market. So I can't say it's overcrowded. There is a lot of opportunity for Mongolian banks as well.
And Nick, from an investor side and a banking enthusiast or expert, what do you think about the banking system overall in Mongolia and all these new players that we're seeing? Is that raising some noise, or is there bringing new questions to investors when they look at small banks coming? Is there a focus into top tier against the small scale? I don't know, what do you think?
So in terms of who's prepared and who has the ability to come to market, I have to say in Mongolia, it's the 5 systemically important banks, and I would say on the non-bank side, like the local mining champions, right? They're of scale and size where they can tap international markets. So if you look at the banking system in Mongolia, you have 14 banks, 5 have been designated systemically important. The largest bank is called Khulan Bank. It hasn't come to market, which is, personally, I've been surprised. That being said, it's a bank that historically has been managed incredibly well. And I think that Khulan Bank is definitely an issuer that if they want to come to capital markets, they will get pretty good reception. So that's going to be a very easy call. We already have Golomb, we already have TDBM, Trade Development Bank of Mongolia, with outstanding bonds. So by now they're kind of recognized by the market. And I can tell how important it is that they're amping up their game when it comes down to maintaining active intercore discussions with investors and posting their earnings on the website. I mean, some of these basic things that you take for granted in other countries were non-existent in Mongolia. So I think Golomb's done an incredible job in terms of kind of setting the benchmark in that regard. But when you look at the other 2 remaining banks from those like 5 systemically important banks, State Bank, they raised $200 million in a private placement last year. And they've got Bank, which is kind of more of an SME player. I've never done the deep dive on it, but just kind of looking at their numbers, it's actually a pretty decently managed bank. The issue with very similar to State Bank, is that they're much smaller, right? So although they're systemically important, they're kind of distant 4th and 5th compared to the big 3, and printing $300 million might be too big of a bit to bite for them. I just want to say a couple of things about the Mongolian banking system, because there's been a lot going on in the last 10 years, and I don't know why the people realize that. So going back to like 2016, Mongolia went through a major restructuring where they had to sign an agreement with the IMF, and as part of that agreement, the government, the central bank, had to restructure the banking system. And the restructuring that they needed to do was to achieve better disclosure standards and better corporate governance, address some of the very large single obligor exposures, the sector exposures. There was a lot of related party lending that was taking place. So all of these things needed to be recognized. And what the central bank did was, in 2017, they did the first asset quality review, which basically forced the banks to recognize the problematic exposures, provision accordingly. Needless to say that kind of drove some losses in the banking system. So it was a relatively difficult period. The government, a couple of years later, took more initiatives to support the banking sector, primarily by mandating that the 5 state-owned banks should get publicly listed on the local stock exchange. And it also came with a regulation to reduce the concentration on the shareholder base side. So in Mongolia, I come from Eastern Europe, all of our banks are owned, or most of our banks are owned by Western banks. So it's very unusual to see a bank that is owned by 1 or 2 individuals. In Mongolia, with the exception of Khan Bank and State Bank, which as the name suggests, state-owned bank, most of the banks are owned by 1 or 2 individuals. And that is a bit of a structural problem in the long run, which I think prompted the government to kind of come up with this legislative initiative to reduce the concentration of the shareholder base to below 20%, or the maximum exposure for a single shareholder can be 20%. Now that comes with other different challenges, and it's something we can discuss separately. I haven't seen progress on that. I think it all went quiet, so I'd be very happy to get an update on that front. But again, the idea here is to remove that incentive to do related party lending and improve the corporate governance. So clearly there's been progress. Another major thing that was done over the years was that they reduced significantly the amount of dollar exposure. It is the central bank made it very costly, almost prohibitive to issue dollar loans. So as per the most recent numbers that I've seen about the dollarization of the banking system, it's down to below 10%. It obviously varies depending on which bank you're looking at, but that is an incredibly low number, which basically suggests that there is not a lot of FX mismatches on the balance sheet. So certainly a good thing. And the last thing that I think is particularly helpful is that there's been a push to adopt IFRS 9. From what I understand, not just IFRS 9, I mean IFRS on a fully loaded basis. And from what I understand, it's supposed to kick in the summer of this year, first on a voluntary basis. But as someone that looks at banks across many geographies, I obviously rely very heavily on IFRS, and it just makes the life of investors a lot easier. So I kind of digressed a little bit, but I thought that a lot of investors are probably not aware about all these good developments. Again, not everything is perfect. There's more work to be done, but I think a lot of the low-hanging fruits already been addressed.
And you think that there is still space for more players in the system? Like what I'm trying to say is, small banks should be having that market access, or should be looking for something more less risky, maybe local. I don't know, a little bit of that.
Yeah, so this is it's a good question. So one of the challenges about Mongolia is that it's a smaller economy, and respectively, the corporates that come out of Mongolia are even smaller. So a lot of people tend to kind of overlook Mongolia just because it's relatively small. And even internally, I was surprised that I got pushed back initially when I was kind of pounding the table that we should get involved, just because people are like, wow, but it's only 3.5 million, it's 25 billion economy, blah, blah, blah. So you already have that preconceived notion, right? If you're a smaller issuer, and you're outside of those 5 systemically important banks that I mentioned, it's going to be more challenging, but it's not impossible. And I'll give you an example. M-Bank, which is a Mongolian bank that is kind of a digital player. They do a lot of consumer lending, a lot of buy now, pay later. They tap capital markets twice. But again, it's all going to be private placement, right? Very few banks have the scale to come up and print $300 million, $400 million, right? So these smaller banks that need funding can do private placements. And in the case of M-Bank, they did 2 of those. One was 50, the other one was 75 million. The issue that as you kind of go down in size is a lot of times the credit quality gets a little bit kind of murkier. The disclosure standards are not as good. So the structure needs to be better, right? And what we've seen is that some of these structures or private placements come up with either a guarantee or some kind of a backstop or a collateral, and that kind of compensates you for. So bottom line is, it is possible. It just is going to be most probably private placement format, and it's going to be a structure that gives more security to the investor.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And just because we need to tackle a little bit more on the credit rating, what is the Minister of Finance work at the moment on the credit rating? Like, where is the focus there? Trying to get that upgrade. Like, I don't know what's happening at the moment.
So as you all know, the credit rating, the sovereign credit rating has been lifted last October and also a year ago, so 2024 as well. So our job as government is really to keep the fundamentals intact and the fiscal policy discipline, right? So it's not our job to, to do what private sectors can do. So on the credit rating, back in 2024, when it was lifted, it reduces the risk premium by 70 basis points. And then the subsequent credit rating upgrade happened last year, and it reduces the risk premium by another 20 bips. So as we all know, that is a little bit like the ceiling for a lot of our banks and also, businesses' credit rating. So that kind of lifted also the ceiling. So it is really to enable cheaper funding resources into the economy, whether it's sovereign or non-sovereign, right? Because the sovereign credit rating becomes the benchmark for the ceiling for all the other private companies or private sector companies' credit rating. So the focus is really to keep it and, if possible, also upgrade it. Yeah, but we also know that we just came from an IMF World Bank Spring meeting where all the ministers of finances and central bank governors come together to talk about the issues in the Middle East conflict. And, the Washington throwing surprise every other day does not help us. It gives us, more uncertainty and to be more proactive. But the policy that the Ministry of Finance is taking is really to keep the fiscal the budget disciplined. 6 years ago, the budget deficit was 12% of the GDP, and now it's the ceiling is 2% of the GDP, so it's been intact. And also complementary to the debt management policy and framework we have taken, combined all of those would help us keep the rating or even to upgrade it. Yeah.
And in your view, that upgrade is lagging? Like it should be done? Is it lagging? Like the fundamentals and the situation in Mongolia is already deserves an upgrade, or you think that you are not there yet?
So representing Ministry of Finance, I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to quote one of our investors. So MFG, which in DC, we had 2 rounds of investor meeting where they all subscribed into our sovereign bond, and we had a Q&A session where we answered, a lot of the questions, and some of them were white noises relating to the political, change, etc. So the MSG said that our credit rating is underestimated. But we're gonna see. As I said, we are cautiously positive because of the new uncertainty, and the Middle East conflict will definitely have an impact on everybody, including Mongolia. So that's gonna push the inflation higher, and also that means, some of the fuel prices and also like explosives and fertilizers, etc., are going to be more expensive. And as a government, we are not trying to wrestle with the prices, because that's, first of all, unsustainable, and second of all, not smart. So we will let the market dictate the price, and our focus is really to be on the supply chain side and not to have an interrupted supply chain for the key ingredients.
Thank you very much. So I don't know if there is any question from the public.
Hi, my name is Michael Madden. I'm involved in banking in Mongolia. Statement and a question. I'm on the board of Hasbank and have been involved with Hasbank from many years ago. Hasbank is probably one of the most profitable banks in that 5-category sector. In terms of the ownership rules, just to clarify what Nikolai said, there's no more than 20% owned by any one shareholder, the only bank that is complying. But they're just facts. I think all the 5 banks do a great job: Juan Bank, Garmendia, TDB, and Haas. Haas is primarily internationally owned, but operated locally. All the executive team are local. I think there's a couple of issues that I see, having been involved in the banking market for so long in Mongolia, and Nikolai touched on them as well. It doesn't really open it up for investors to come into the market. And it's good having that cap on ownership at 20%. But if a strategic wants to come into Mongolia, it really is limited. There's very little activity on the stock market. I think the biggest activity is our share buyback as it relates to Hasbank shares. So if there's true belief in scaling the banking market and opening up the banking market, I think some of these things need to change. And it's not just moving the ownership from 20% up to 34%. That's just symbolic at the end of the day. If you want to get strategics in and you really want to turn this market around, you need to allow for foreign banks to come in and play a role in the Mongolian market. And I think it will open up and provide financial access to other parts of the economy as well, because some of it is taken offshore. So my question really is, and we hear this noise all the time, but it needs fundamental change. And I'll say this as an Irish guy, I think there's a bit of protectionism. That's my perception, because the other banks are held by other groups. And unless that is unlocked and we get strategics in, I don't think the market's really going to change. So anyway, just an observation as you're talking about investors coming in. Very hard for investors to come into the market. Very, very hard. And it's kind of like translating those words into action. And I know in government it's difficult, but a lot of you have come from the private sector. You know how it works.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Andres Ordemola with Tatari Trends, Geopolitical and Business Advisory. A question for the Deputy Minister. Is Mongolia going to allow the MIR system to be integrated into the financial system? I've seen reporting saying that there are, steps being taken for a few years now, and I wonder where the state of that is today.
Can you elaborate a bit more on the MIR system?
Yes, so UnionPay, Visa, MasterCard, right? The Russian system is MIR. And I was wondering if you know kind of where the new government's plans for integrating that into the country, or if any of you know.
I think it's more to question to Anar, who is sitting there from our central bank.
Okay.
Yeah, but in terms of the payment system, the banking sector in Mongolia is probably, one of the, I think the banking system is quite advanced in terms of payments and settlement and transactions compared to, the peer economies. When you say the MIR system, I would rather open the floor to central bank. Of course, we have certain challenges because we have 2 big neighbors and we have to keep the payment to the fuel and diesel flow. But that doesn't mean that we are also very cautious that we won't be captured by any of the sanctions, Yeah.
Thank you.
Wait. I think from the central bank, they want to...
Yes, I'm Anar, and the Director General of the Payment System. Yes, and the payment system, payment ecosystem is quite advanced level in Mongolia, and almost 99% of payment through the digital. And of course, you mentioned WeChat, Apple Pay, Google Pay. Recently, last like 2 years, and we accepting all Apple Pay, Google Pays, and also that cross-border payment. And of course, we have a mainly SWIFT, but there are 2 giant neighbor, which is the SIPs, maybe recently that. But SIPs have advanced and good side and also was the weak side because of the it's a one currency system. And also the Russia side, they approaching SPFS and the Russian system, but at the moment we only more the mainly in the SWIFT. SWIFT is the main or cross-border system. Of course, the application and more retail payment systems we still accepting. We are also using here.
Thank you very
have
much.
more question, and reach out to me.
Sure. Yes, good morning. My name is Jake Hartnett. I'm an economic advisor. So my question is about risks and where you see the main risks facing the Mongolian economy. Certainly on the consumer side for the banking sector, there's been a very uneven recovery post-COVID. Household debt is very high. On the state side, we see recently the failure of, or the bankruptcy of Urchist Mongol, the state-owned enterprise. And it's a reminder of some of the past problems around the development bank and so forth, and off-budget financing. So I'm wondering, as you think about these things, you know, what is keeping you up at night? What are you keeping an eye on? Thank you.
So thank you very much for your question. A couple of years ago, from macroprudential perspective, obviously the consumer indebtedness was becoming more of an issue, and since then, both central government, Central Bank of Mongolia, and the Financial Regulatory Commission has been taking some action to tame the consumer loans. So there were certain actions, for example, both in terms of funding and also in terms of the disbursement. So that has been quite intact so far. So on the consumer loan. So in terms of the, you mentioned about Erdene Mongol? Urchist Mongol. So during the last government, it was decided that the Urchist Mongol has become, you know, the non-mining group, which is similar to Temasek in Singapore, and just to streamline the businesses and operations, etc. But then it was also on the governance side. It was there was a bit of an issue in terms of whether the Ministry of Energy is in charge of certain things or whether Urchist Mongol is in charge of certain things. So, and at the end, it was decided by the cabinet meeting to demolish it. So it is, from governance perspective, we see it's maybe better that way to have more streamlined decision making, because energy sector is quite important, as Deputy Minister has said, and we can't afford to have you know, any problem, and then after the problem we don't know who is held accountable for. And you mentioned about DBM, right?
Yeah, so as part of the legacy debt pile, as well as this episode is a reminder of that.
So in terms of the Development Bank of Mongolia, so the governing or supervisory minister is Ministry of Economy and Development, and I think we all know the story of Development Bank of Mongolia, but recently the decision has been made to recapitalize the Development Bank of Mongolia and to bring it back on trajectory.
Thank you very much. Do we have maybe couple of maybe 1 minute for a final remark, maybe from starting from Molan Batar, a final remark to the public, and then we can go with Nick and Ms. Khulan.
So, as a Mongolian banking sector, he asked the last few years that consumer loan portfolio increased a lot, but Central Bank of Mongolia, together with the Financial Regulation Commission, they did tremendous job for last year. So as of today, Mongolian banks, we don't see that consumer loan NPL as a problem. So all the big banks, all the banks and all the big NBFIs as of today, supplying its data to credit bureau system on time. So that means we won't see that consumer loan NPL increases as a not that much problem. And Mongolian banking sector always we keep increasing our risk management. And, you know, as I mentioned before, always the leading sector for the governance, reporting, and also Mongolian banking sector, Mongolian Banking Association CEO is also sitting here. So you can ask the risk-related question from him also. So Mongolian banking sector performing well. So next few years, we expecting there will be huge growth, not only profit side, also risk management government side. So there will be soon many Mongolian banks issuing the bond in international market. So as investors, I can assure you, so governance, related party ratio, reporting, transparency, it's best bonds to buy is Mongolian banks bond. So.
Thank you. Nick.
Yeah, just on the consumer lending side, the central bank, by the way, took some macroprudential measures to kind of slow down that growth, and we've seen that already taking place. They lowered the debt-to-income ratio that you need to satisfy. It used to be fairly aggressive at 60%. They brought it to 55, then most recently 50%. They increased the reserve requirements for both local currency and dollars more recently. So they're trying to kind of make it more expensive to lend. That being said, if you kind of look at how the banking system has evolved over the last 3 years, it grew 20% in 2023, then it grew 35%. That was the peak in 2024. Loan growth moderated to, again, 20% in 2025 and is guided for another 20%. So what I'm going to do as an analyst is I'm going to keep a very close eye on the seasoning of those books. We've already seen non-performing exposure, early delinquency buckets kind of start going up. And a lot of that it's kind of intuitive to take place as the book starts seasoning. One thing that I've noticed is that the reserve coverage ratios of the banks are getting thinner and thinner at a time when they're growing at a very fast rate. So there's stuff to be steps to be taken there. And on the capital side, they used to have pretty strong capital buffers, but because of that very strong loan growth over the last 3 to 4 years, a lot of those buffers, have been eroded. So they still look good. It's just that excess capital is not there anymore, right? And because they're listed entities, they pay 30 to 40%, of their profits as dividends. So that kind of ability to rebuild those capital very quickly, capital ratios very quickly is not that easy anymore, right? So that should serve as a deterrent to expected loan growth. But when we talk about Mongolia, the sovereign itself, one thing that we want to do is they're obviously doing a great job with all these mining projects. Ideally, and I think it came up in a couple of the presentations, we want to see the Mongolian economy start diversifying, right? And the sectors that were mentioned, this is clearly where Mongolia has a competitive advantage, whether it's tourism, renewable energy, agriculture, Kashmir, you name it. Another thing that ideally we want to see, and I know this is not going to happen tomorrow, it's going to take time, is there is a very big inequality gap. And we want to see, just for the sake of social stability, that Mongolia is able to build a good, solid middle class, which we currently don't have. And again, this is going to take time, but these are kind of my two recommendations for on a sovereign level.
Thanks, Nick. Ms. Khulan?
Well, I can't agree enough with Nick on building middle class and diversifying away the economy. Just to add, from Minister of Finance perspective, starting from 2025, we've started rebuilding the domestic yield curve, which were non-existent for about since 2017. So that's really important milestone we are taking, and not only the rate itself, but also the maturity profile is important. So we have now like from 6 months to 7 years maturity profile on 6 notches, and we will continue building the yield curve. So this was also in line with what Moody's and rating agencies has been advising us to do so. And just because back in 2017, our debt level was unsustainable and we didn't have the political and social license to continue to do so. So that's one thing we've started doing, and we'll keep on doing that. On the rating side, I think we've discussed enough. We'll try and keep it, if not upgrade it, and that includes all the macro fundamentals and as well as the outlook of the economy. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everybody, and thanks everybody.